Hello, I'm April Cheek Messier, President of the National D-Day Memorial, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to a special Lunchbox lecture for June. Earlier this month, we were privileged to welcome Dr. John C. McManus to give a special presentation at the memorial for some of our valued supporters. The topic of this lecture was his most recent book, the third part of his groundbreaking trilogy on the U.S. Army in the Pacific in World War II, To the End of the Earth, the U.S. Army, and the Downfall of Japan, 1945. It was a fascinating talk, so for those who were not there, or those who wish to hear it again, we want to share John's recorded lecture in this virtual format. Because it was filmed not in our virtual studio, but live, the quality is not quite as high as some of our others, but we think you'll enjoy it nonetheless. John C. McManus is Curator's Distinguished Professor of U.S. Military History at the Missouri University of Science and Technology. As one of the nation's leading military historians and the author of 15 well-received books, he is in frequent demand as a speaker and expert commentator. In addition to dozens of local and national radio programs, he has appeared on CNN.com, Fox News, C-SPAN, the Military Channel, the Discovery Channel, the History Channel, and PBS, among many others. He is the host of two podcasts, Someone Talked, which is the official podcast of the National D-Day Memorial, and We Have Ways of Making You Talk USA, alongside Al Murray and James Holland. Please enjoy this fascinating talk by our friend, John McManus, recorded earlier at the National D-Day Memorial.
I'd like to also thank my buddy John Long, my fellow co-host, partner in crime with the Someone Talk podcast, and all of the staff for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank all veterans, by the way, too. Thank you for your service, regardless of era, and D-Day Society members in particular, because I so appreciate the support you are giving for this remarkable institution. I'm honored to work with the National D-Day Memorial. It's just been so much fun the last 2 years. We've been working closely together, and so that means that I greatly appreciate the contributions that each and every one of you make to make this such a successful place. I really like where the memorial is now, where it's headed in the future. We're so excited about our capital project. So I see a lot of familiar faces here from last year when I spoke. You're back to here again. Good to see you. So what I want to focus on tonight is, of course, the Army in the Pacific in 1945. This is the concluding volume of my trilogy. And so where's the Army at that point? It's an Army that's really beginning to reach full maturity. That it's begun to kind of, the war is a kind of provincial force. But by now, 1945, as it begins, you've got 1.4 million ground soldiers serving somewhere in the Pacific Federation. And it's going to be 1.8 million by the time the war is over. And, as you sort of look at the map here, this is about a third of the world's surface of continent, ocean, island. And so it's an army that is spread from Alaska to the jungles of Burma, to great places. It's a dispersion of geography that's so vast, so enormous that it is not under one single commander. It couldn't be, really, and that was really kind of unprecedented in American history before and since. In the course of the war, as I mentioned, you've got about 1.8 million ground soldiers who served in the war against Japan. To give you a little perspective, that's the third largest army, military force that this country has ever sent overseas to fight a war, behind only the European theater in World Wars I and II. The Army mobilized something in the order of about 21 infantry and airborne divisions in the Pacific and Asia theater, but really it was an armored group made up of multiple tank battalions. There's independent teams that really equate to about another 4 divisions of manpower. And yet, I think, and one of the things that kind of led me to write this trilogy, I think in our sort of popular memory of the war, there's a sense that the Army focused on the war in Europe, on beating Hitler in Germany in the European theater, and they let the Marines focus on the ground combat in the war against Japan. And that's kind of our popular memory of the war, especially the famous Marine-oriented battles like Guadalcanal, Okinawa, Peleliu. But by the way, all three of those are also Army battles, and that's sort of my point. That actually, when you really look at the war against Japan, the vast majority of fighting and the plurality of the dying was done by the United States Army. At full strength, the Marine Corps mobilized 6 divisions in the Pacific Theater of World War II. 6. So there's almost 4 times that many Army combat units that are going to be in play. And I don't mention this at all to the Marine Corps, actually really the opposite. Because when you get a sense, there weren't that many Marines. And the Marines, by design, were really a kind of combat-oriented service in which the bulk of their manpower is doing that in addition to so many other necessary, really unglamorous jobs that are in support and whatever else. Okay, so they're working together as partners, and this isn't just a sort of passing, I didn't know that kind of thing, anecdotal little bit of information nugget. It actually is, I think, deeply important to understand the nature of this war and the Army's war in particular in the 21st century, and here's why I say that. Because if you think, when you sort of think about the war against Japan, if you think, well, that was a maritime theater where the Navy was kind of just taking on the Imperial Japanese Navy, and then whatever ground fighting needed to be done was done by Marine Expeditionary Forces, you really don't quite grasp what a future war in the Pacific Asia theater could actually mean. When you look at World War II, what actually happened is you needed a mass army. And you needed one with a lot of different skill sets that the U.S. Army eventually is going to have in the war against Japan. One of which, of course, is amphibious operations. So here's another one. Lieutenant General Rival Eichelberger's 8th Army alone carried out 35 in the Philippines in the spring of 1945 in the summer. Just to give you kind of a sense of scale here. So about 42,000 of these kind of guys, these U.S. Army soldiers, would not survive this war against Japan. And they're felled by a mixture of combat, the terrible privation of captivity. You know, some 30,000 plus Americans end up as POWs of the Japanese. The bulk of them were from the U.S. Army. 37% did not survive. So obviously that accounts for some of this harvest of death too. To give you a sort of a larger perspective in the span of American history, those 42,000 Army soldiers who lose their lives in the war against Japan, that was more than the United States had lost in every previous war in its history, except for, of course, the Civil War and World War I. So every other war you name prior to World War II, you would have had, more Army soldiers killed or die in the Pacific theater than were killed in that entire war. It gives you a sense of this and the sort of human scale. So by now, in 1945, this Army is becoming just staggeringly complex, with vast capabilities that I would say are seldom seen in the course of human events, much less military history. And it's an Army that by 1945 had proven itself quite adept at performing just a breathtaking variety of missions. I'll give you a few examples. Grand strategical planning. The Army is doing that, of course, in tandem with other services, in tandem with allies, in and of itself, the coordination, figuring out the future course of the war. All of that grand strategy is a big part of what the Army is doing, especially, of course, at the senior level. Inter-service coordination, and here you see the incredible importance of this. I mentioned the Army and the Marine Corps are going to tend to fight together, although the Army fights a lot of battles alone in this war, more so than the Marine Corps. There are only a tiny few exclusively Marine Corps battles, like Tarawa would be one example, fighting and dying done by the Marines. But inter-service coordination is, of course, incredibly important. The Army is going nowhere without the Navy. And of course, you need the Army Air Forces. By the way, that number I gave you, 1.8 million, that doesn't even take into account the Army Air Forces. And as you know, I'm sure, in World War II, the Air Force was part of the Army. So this was just Army ground soldiers in that number I gave you. So yeah, I mean, you're coordinating with them, you're coordinating with other units, you're coordinating the shipping. Shipping is so important. Everything has to be shipped, from you know, paper to bullets to shells, uniforms, you name it. And so that requires a lot of coordination. It really has to be quite sophisticated. There's, of course, joint operations with allies, you know, especially the Australians. The Australians really carry the load for the Allies in the South Pacific in 1942 and 43, and there is no nation in World War II that mobilizes more of its population into uniform percentage-wise than does Australia. 1 million Americans passed through Australia or served there in the course of the war. And so you can kind of see the sort of productive relationship, a kind of blood brother alliance, I call it, that's established then. And that is one of the most tragic and flawed alliances in American history in terms of what eventually happens. So, you know, the Army is handling a lot of this, and it's also working with local guerrillas, especially in the Philippines, who are a huge part of the campaign in the Philippines by 1944 and 45. So you've got that. Intelligence gathering on a scale that's just massive. You know, you've got all these invasions that are in the offing. You have to know what's the size of the Japanese garrison, what's their strength, where are they, what is their disposition, what is their supply like, all those kinds of things. You know, what are the Japanese planning to do next in terms of their grand strategy? The Army's involved in that, especially through a lot of code breaking and translation. There's a major translation effort of captured Japanese material done primarily by Japanese Americans who are, of course, U.S. Army soldiers. Engineering. It's engineering on a scale seldom before seen in human history. Think of all the know-how that has to go into building airfields. The aviation engineers are some of the most important players in this war, because whenever you invade an island, you generally want it for an airfield, to develop an airfield, to capture an airfield, improve it, whatever. The Army's aviation engineers are constantly doing that, in addition to all the other typical engineer missions, dealing with mines, dealing with booby traps, building roads. I mean, imagine trying to maintain and build roads in monsoon conditions, you know, or build roads out of jungle wilderness, build ports. All that kind of stuff comes under the ledger of engineering. Transportation, trucking, jeeps, moving supplies to the front, all those kinds of things, but also transportation by water. In fact, the Army is so big, so multivariate in World War II, that it has its own Navy, believe it or not. And the Navy is somehow okay with this because it's overstretched to the max. So you end up with U.S. Army transports that are moving people and freight and whatnot, and that's a kind of one-off that you see during World War II. You've got medical care on a scale that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier. World War II in the Pacific is to some extent an interspecies war. The mosquitoes can kill you much worse than the Japanese in some instances because of disease. And so you've got to control that. You've got to make sure soldiers are healthy, not to mention treating combat wounded and all the other disease problems that come up and weather-related issues and all that. So you're fighting in some of the world's most inhospitable locales. So the Army, of course, is dealing with ground combat operations on a scale that's just sort of mind-blowing. Of just existing in these climates, much less supplying people and fighting and defeating a very difficult, tenacious enemy. So the Army finds itself plunged into an elemental death struggle, a war with little quarter asked or given. You know, and I think that that's important too, because it's sort of characterized our wars ever since. Fighting adversaries that don't necessarily recognize the nice guy style of war and rules of warfare and whatnot, mistreating prisoners, deliberately shooting medics, you know, things like that. You see this in the Pacific, and again, unfortunately, that's been a harbinger of ever since. So, you know, when you look at this, you can see the Pacific War kind of glimpses the future, the moral ambiguities, forcing the Americans to kind of come to terms with what is their moral base? How are they going to treat their enemies? How are they going to respond to savagery, with savagery or not? You know, all those kind of ambiguities. Rapidly modernizing, deadlier weapons, how you move them in place, how you keep them supplied, racial strife, post-colonial uncertainty, flawed alliances, all this kind of stuff sort of anticipates the future. And also just where it's fought. with the exception of a few American conflicts after World War II, Grenada, Panama, Mogadishu. Every American war since World War II has been fought somewhere on the Asian landmass. And ground fighting, by the way, has accounted for 90% of American war deaths. At the very time when air and sea power was supposed to make ground power sort of marginalized, when wars wouldn't be fought on the ground anymore, guess what happened? Wars were fought on the ground, and that's where most of the fighting and dying happened, and most of it by Army soldiers with a major assist from the Marine Corps. So I don't propose to walk you through the Army's entire 1945 experience. For that, of course, you have to buy the book and read it, which I do recommend. I've heard the book's good, so, I haven't read it yet, but I recommend it to you. But I'll just give you a few highlights here. And I think, of course, when we're talking about the Army in the Pacific, we just have to start with discussion of this guy, don't we? The Olympian Zeus of theater, as he would have seen himself, General Douglas MacArthur. And you see him here as a five-star general. So he had just been promoted to five-star in December 1944. And of course, by 1945, he's on the cusp of what is for him really something of a crusade. And that is to liberate the Philippines, particularly what's often called the main island of Luzon, which of course for him is home. He had lived in Manila. Douglas MacArthur's family had long ties with the Philippines and its people, dating back to his father, who had been the commander of American military forces in the Philippines in the early 20th century during the Philippine-American War, basically an American colonial war to control the archipelago as a colony. Douglas had served there in his first posting out of West Point in the early 20th century, and it's at that time that he begins this love affair with the archipelago and its people. Of course, he's different than any other American general in World War II in that he once held the top spot in the Army. He was the Army Chief of Staff in the 1930s, and so in World War II, he's a theater commander, which technically is a grade below, but he has seniority over pretty much everybody. So he's in a weird kind of spot there. He's political in some respects. He has run this kind of sub rosa campaign for president in 1943 and 44 while on active duty and commanding military forces in the South Pacific. He wanted the Republican nomination. That had gone nowhere, so he had shelved that idea by 1945. And to him, obviously he's been through a lot in this war, having been kicked out of the Philippines and ordered out by FDR. He wants to come back and redeem himself, redeem the United States. He wants to liberate the archipelago from what he sees as a harsh Japanese occupation. There was a great deal of truth to that. And in some ways, MacArthur sort of prefers that over an invasion of Japan itself and sees that as the key to victory more so than subduing Tokyo itself in some ways. So he's of course fascinating. He's complex to the point of convolution. A close aide once said of him, "None of us really knew MacArthur. We all saw fragments of the man." And there was a great deal of truth to that. He was remarkably courageous. He was epically conniving too, so he had these two sides to him. And he believed that America's future lay in the Pacific and Asia. And I think when we look back on that, I think there's some level of truth to that we'd say MacArthur did have some insight into the future. He had some feeling that he was a man of destiny. Lieutenant Colonel Dusty Rhodes, his pilot, who knew him really as well as anybody because he spent so much time, as he once said of him. He said he seemed to believe he was especially protected so that he could fulfill a mission. And of course, that mission is the liberation of the Philippines. So his two key instruments toward that end were his Army commanders, the commander of the 6th Army and the commander of the 8th Army. So without any further ado, the guy on the left is the commander of the 6th Army, Lieutenant General Walter Krueger, who is also, I think, just a fascinating figure. Krueger was actually born in Germany. He was born in 1881, so he's 1 year younger than MacArthur. Krueger's father had been in the German army, but he dies when Krueger is an adolescent. And so Krueger's mother emigrated with Walter to the United States when he was a kid. And think of that, that's tough. It's a difficult situation. He's got to come and adjust to a new culture, learn a new language. Krueger spoke multiple languages, French, Spanish, of course, German, and English, and he was proud that he spoke English with hardly a trace of an accent. What's interesting to me is that they initially settled in St. Louis, which of course is my hometown and where I live. And the reason they did that is because apparently he had an uncle who owned a brewery in St. Louis. And that was a very, very common thing. German American St. Louis economy The most famous one, of course, is Anheuser-Busch, which has survived in our own time. So initially, they go and they settle in St. Louis. Eventually, they'll move elsewhere. But where his military career begins during the Spanish-American War. So he's 17 years old in 1898 when the war breaks out, and he joins the Army as a private soldier. So he joins the Army as a private soldier, and then he retires like almost half a century later as a 4-star general. I mean, it's just incredible. It's this sort of military Horatio Alger story. He goes through the NCO ranks. He gets commissioned actually while he's stationed in the Philippines in the early 20th century, so he knew the archipelago very well, especially Luzon. He becomes this kind of self-taught military professional. So not only did Krueger, unlike many of his peers, have no West Point pedigree, he had no college degree, he had no high school diploma. And I would dare say that'll never happen again in the history of our military forces. You have a 4-star general who is basically self-educated. He's a total autodidact. And he becomes this kind of military wonk, writing these kind of scholarly military articles. He has a passion for military history, and he has a passion for troops. And he can really relate to private soldiers because he was one. He doesn't have much regard, like once he becomes a colonel and a general, for his peers. And though he's a very warm and sensitive person to his family, incredible soulmate to his wife Grace, and a great father to his 3 kids, he doesn't have that touchy-feely side on duty. He's brusque, he's rude, he's Prussian in the description of the time, sort of demeaning, I think, but that's how many of the colleagues describe him. So he could really rub you the wrong way, but he was awfully good. There's an interesting quote about him from a guy who served under him as his chief of staff. Few generals were physically tougher or more active, relentlessly driving himself. He had little need of driving others. They were quick to follow his example. Who was that guy? Dwight Eisenhower, who had served under Krueger and been mentored by him. One of his commanders, who had served in the Philippines as part of 6th Army, once assessed of him, I think this is funny, he was a good soldier and a good strategist and a very sound thinker, but he didn't have much of a personality. And that's exactly him. He's just not a personal kind of warm, fuzzy kind of dude. So I'll give you the one little anecdote, though, that shows that he could display a human side even among soldiers, too. One day he was scheduled to inspect an infantry unit in New Guinea that was supposed to be training up for the invasion of Biak. And instead, the soldiers were playing a volleyball game. So they're supposed to be out training, and instead they're playing volleyball. And everybody's worried that when General Krueger got there, he'd really chew people out and all this. Instead of doing that, he sat down on a log and said, keep playing. I want to see who won the game, who wins the game. So the soldiers who were in that unit never forgot that. The officers were like, phew, but they also kind of wondered, was that just his good mood that day or what? So he could be human. He could. But not always to his fellow generals. Now, the guy who commands the other army, 8th Army, couldn't be more different temperamentally than Krueger, although they have a lot in common in terms of their character. This is Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger. Eichelberger comes from Ohio, and he's the son of a Union veteran of the Civil War, who was quite a successful lawyer, very successful gentleman farmer, like in Urbana, Ohio. And so Eichelberger had multiple siblings. He had 4 siblings, 3 brothers, 1 sister, and he was the youngest. And so Eichelberger's father, like a lot of parents, particularly parents who have been through war, became convinced my kids are soft. They'll never they're not up to things were tough back in my day, and they'll never measure up, and all this kind of stuff that all generations go through, but especially if you've been through the Civil War, So he would constantly test his kids, pit them against each other in competitions. I like to say it was almost like a reality show kind of thing. Okay, but imagine you're part of this, but you're the youngest. So you're not as big and strong and developed as your siblings, and so you constantly come out on the short end. And so no one took Bobby very seriously. They all loved him. He had a wonderful sense of humor. He was warm, he was witty, he was charming, and everybody loved him. But they're like, little Bobby isn't really going to amount to much. We'll all protect him. And so he always had this kind of chip on his shoulder, for lack of a better way to put it, of trying to achieve something that would show distinction. And he finds that in the Army. He gets an appointment to West Point. He graduates in the class of 1909, and he is just kind of a natural infantry soldier.
Where most of his peers during the outbreak of World War I had gone to the Western Front, or had hoped to, he actually gets sent to Russia. It was what was called the Polar Bear Expedition, when the Western Allies and Japan sent military forces to Russia to try and strangle and destroy the Bolshevik regime during the Russian Civil War. Of course, that fails, but Eichelberger gets combat experience. He gets a Distinguished Service Cross. He serves as an intel officer, so that information gathering there. And I think quite meaningfully for the future, he's embedded for a while with a Japanese Army unit, and he studies the Japanese. And so he knows them fairly well by the time World War II breaks out. So he's got combat experience. So in terms of his personality, Eichelberger had no enemies. He was just a fun person to be around. Charming, thoughtful, empathetic, just nice. He had a soulmate in his wife, Emma, but they had a very powerful bond. They had no kids. They had each other. They had Bob's career. And during World War II, he wrote to her 2, sometimes 3 times a day, even when he's in combat. So it's great for an historian, of course, to have all that great info right there at your fingertips. You know, what's tragic, though, is Emma, of course, had written to him quite a bit, and those letters do not survive. She did not want them to be public, and she went so far as to destroy those letters, unfortunately. So we only get one side of the story there. So in terms of his operational outlook, Eichelberger is very similar to one of his classmates with whom he maintains a friendship his whole life, and we heard him named earlier, George Patton. In fact, I found correspondence between the two of them in World War II, and I think in terms of their military philosophy, how to lead soldiers in combat, they're very, very similar. So Eichelberger, as one of his many close friends once described him, one of the most colorful and attractive individuals it's been my good fortune to meet. General Eichelberger had a rare way with people. He enjoyed people, all kinds of people. And because of his lively curiosity, vitality, and basic optimism, he never became an old man. And above all, he was honest. So here you see a guy who's honest, who's got really solid character, who has a very good relationship with his wife. So it's like, why do he and Krueger conflict? Well, because Krueger's rude. And Eichelberger can't fathom that. He's like, why do you have to be this way? Why do you say things that are so nasty and mean? And why are you so abrupt? Can't you see how that angers people? And so over time, Eichelberger eventually kind of has no use for Krueger on a personal level, but more meaningfully, they're very different operationally. Krueger, the word often associated with him is cautious, and there's a lot, and I think for well or ill. You know, he's methodical, he's cautious, he's circumspect. He's a good guy you want, to plan the battle and carry it out when not much is going to go wrong. Eichelberger is much more bold, much more of a risk taker, much more aggressive, as being way too fussy and stodgy and methodical. So that's the conflict. Now, when the invasion happens of Luzon, and by the way, it's called S-Day, in MacArthur's theater, Southwest Pacific area, or SWAPA, they never called invasions D-Day because that was associated with Normandy. Not much because he'd once been an aide and he'd left, and MacArthur thought of him as a kind of a turncoat. So they come up with their own little terms for their invasions, and this one's called S-Day. Now, it's a major success. You can see 4 U.S. Army divisions that are going to invade on that day, and there's not that much ground opposition, but I should point out that leading up to it, the Japanese had launched kamikaze attacks, mainly from land-based air in the Philippines, but also in present-day Taiwan, in an attempt to stop that fleet, a major fleet that was, obviously carrying this invasion force. And they do damage. They damage 24 ships, they kill 503 sailors, and they kill Lieutenant General Herbert Lumsden, who was a British liaison officer to MacArthur's headquarters, and was they're not able to stop the invasion, and that really does away with the kamikazes in the Philippines. The Japanese are going to husband the rest of their kamikazes to use at Iwo Jima and especially at Okinawa. So you basically control the air. What kind of Japanese opposition is there? Well, you can see on the map, 14th Area Army under General Tomoyuki Yamashita, who is arguably the best commander in the Imperial Japanese Army, has about 280,000 soldiers, 287,000, that are split among 3 major regions, just east of Manila, west of Manila, and then the largest group in the north under Yamashita. 6th Army then, once ashore, faces this enormous task of sustaining itself. It's not glamorous, but it's war. Unloading freight, moving the supplies, developing the airfields, reconstructing the roads. There's 11,000 short tons of supplies and ammo that are moving across the beaches every day. Imagine all that freight, and that's just the bare minimum. The major job you've got ahead of yourself to develop depots and rail lines. Filipino labor and guerrillas are a huge part of this operation on so many levels. The Filipinos really take the lead in their own liberation. And so I Corps, as you see, so like what is a corps? It's multiple divisions. So I Corps, like Roman numeral 1, will focus on holding that northern flank against the possibility that Yamashita could counterattack, while 14th Corps will make the dash from Manila, which of course is the key objective of the whole campaign. You've got two primary objectives. Clark Field, which is a series of airfields northwest of Manila, and obvious why you need that. And then Manila, which of course is the capital of the Philippines, a beautiful modern city of about 1.1 million people. And obviously for the political symbolism of that, for its symbolism of liberating the archipelago, but you need Manila for logistics. It is a major harbor, so you need it in order to have a place to land supplies and all that. So Manila is to the Philippines campaign like what Antwerp and Marseille are to the campaign in France for Eisenhower. 14th Corps is going to try and make this push down there for Manila. Now they're under Krueger's control, Krueger's 6th Army. Okay, so as I mentioned, he's a careful, sensible tactician. He's not constitutionally inclined to absorb major risks. He's worried that the Japanese are going to come out of the hills to the east and counterattack him as he's got these columns leading down to Manila. And he becomes almost worried to the point of inertia in some respects. 6th Army is only moving about 2 to 3 miles a day as you get deeper into January. And exasperated MacArthur is constantly prodding General Krueger to go faster. In Krueger's defense, one of the problems you've got is not really the Japanese opposition, but you've got all these streams and rivers and whatnot. There's 217 wood bridges that are out between the landing beaches in Manila. So engineers have to rebuild them. That takes time. You can move infantry across a lot of these streams, but not vehicles and freight and all that. So that's what has to be done. But still, 6th Army could have moved a lot faster. In truth, and this is only my opinion and expressed in the book, MacArthur really is only himself to blame for this situation. I mean, he gets to the point where he locates his headquarters ahead of 6th Army headquarters as a sort of way to shame Krueger into moving faster. It doesn't work. But why is MacArthur at fault? If you wanted this quick dash to Manila, which obviously you would, Krueger's not the person to do that. You're miscasting a good actor. Eichelberger is the person to do that, okay? And instead, he gives the job to Krueger, and it just does not really work out that well. So, adjusting to that, MacArthur decides to put a division under Eichelberger, as you see there, and they land at Nasugbu on January 31st, 1945. That's the 11th Airborne Division, which is just an incredible unit. They are sarcastically nicknamed the Angels, and they got that because there were, during training in the US, there were so many guys who would end up, shall we say, locally incarcerated after Saturday nights out and things like that, that staff officers would say, well, how many Angels do we have unaccounted for today? You know, that kind of thing. So they embraced that. And their commander, Major General Joseph Swing, is every bit as swashbuckling and aggressive as Eichelberger. And so this is a sort of match made in heaven here. And when 11th Airborne Division comes ashore, it basically outfights, outwits, outthinks the Japanese at pretty much every turn, going up that 67-mile narrow road toward the southern environs of Manila there. There's an airborne landing, not very well known, but the 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment will land at Tagaytay Ridge, and then they'll hook up with the rest of the division, and then they'll have a column moving north. Okay, so they're very outnumbered. This is 8,000 guys. They're very much outnumbered, but they're advancing very quickly. In the meantime, 1st Cavalry Division and the 37th Infantry Division are approaching the city from the other side, and also dealing with Clark Field and all that kind of stuff. So you've got then the showdown in Manila. The bad news is that the 11th Airborne Division is stopped in the southern environs of Manila because the Japanese had constructed a layered urban fortification line called the Gangko Line. And you just could not overwhelm that without more troops. Okay, and very tough too. What's happened here, Yamashita will later claim he did not plan to defend Manila. And yet, you know, he didn't contest the landing because he figured the best thing I can do here, because they control the air and the sea, I can just hunker down in the mountains, all kinds of good caves and other terrain, and I can bleed these guys, and maybe the Americans then will negotiate some sort of end of the war without occupying Japan or whatever. Okay, and that makes some sense. So if that's your strategy, a city is perfect for that. Urban combat, with, you know, when defenders can just chew up attacking formations, the destruction inherent in that. Yamashita will claim later he didn't intend to defend Manila, and you have to take him at his word, but I think it's amazing that a commander of that quality didn't really see the opportunity here. So why do we end up with a major battle in Manila? Well, as you've seen, Yamashita is distant from a lot of his command. And the other thing you may know, the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy don't get along well at all. And so Manila has a lot of naval troops who are in the city and around it and at the port, and they don't necessarily accede to Yamashita's authority, and they're going to decide, we're going to hunker down and defend here. They dismount a lot of guns and all the explosives and all this, and they don't really have to be trained all that well. They just have to be put in buildings and decide they're going to fight to the death. And so that's what the Americans are up against here, is just a hellacious, horrendous urban combat battle. And it forces you to come to terms with the whole difficulty of invading the Philippines in the first place. You've got to destroy what you want to liberate. Similar to what happens in France, Belgium, in Holland, Luxembourg. You're doing that here too. And so you end up with this block by block, house by house, room by room fight that goes on throughout February 1945. There's about 17,000 Japanese holdouts there. And, you know, the Americans bring in eventually every weapon they can, you know, because they need it. Initially, they didn't want to minimize the destruction. Hard to do that. So they're going to use everything they can. The combat was intimate, bloody, horrifying. Quote, kick in the door, Sergeant Warren Mather, the 5th Cavalry Regiment recalled, stick in the flamethrower nozzle, roast the Japanese alive. I can still hear them screaming. I can still smell the burning flesh. It's horrifying. Even then, according to one intel officer, infantrymen had to enter dugouts, caverns, and pillboxes and annihilate them before resistance ceased. Horrifying, traumatic intimacy characterized this fighting. And this is a sort of a close-on look at where the two divisions are fighting, right in the heart of downtown Manila, where there was a lot of very sturdy structures that have been built to resist earthquakes. The Philippines get a lot of earthquakes, of course, and so that only helps the defenders that much more. And I apologize for the difficult nature of this discussion, but this is what happened. You have Japanese bodies just lying everywhere, and this is the kind of combat you're talking about. To guard against ambushers playing dead, U.S. soldiers would just pump bullets into the heads of nearly every corpse, then sprinkle them with lime to try and dampen the stench. And believe me, the lime didn't work. The worst aspect of the battle is probably the terrible destruction wrought on the people. And again, these are awful images, but this is what happened. Of course, the population's caught in the middle of this. 1 million people, and they're getting killed by the firepower of both sides. Untold thousands of people killed or wounded that way, especially from the firepower of the American side, because the Americans have more. In one typical barrage, the Americans utilized 370,000 pounds of ordnance, just to give you a sense of the scale here. Many others fell prey to a series of horrible, deliberate, savage Japanese atrocities. That's probably the majority. Iwabuchi's on the pretext that Filipinos were aiding the Americans, he and other commanders sanctioned killing them all. All people on the battlefield, with the exception of Japanese military personnel, Japanese civilians, will be put to death, declared one chilling order. The order even included instructions about how to dispose of the bodies and advice on how to kill without using much ammo, because they wanted to use their ammo on the Americans. So it ends up with people getting packed into buildings that are burned down, people getting stabbed to death, tortured, raped, horrible things like that. And some of the perpetrators kept ghoulish tallies of how many people they killed using guerrilla as a euphemism for Filipino, for men, women, children. One noted that he had stabbed 10 people. The innocence I possessed at the time of leaving the homeland has long since disappeared. Now I'm a hardened sinner, and my sword is stained with blood. May God forgive me. May my mother forgive me. And I think it's very poignant. This guy didn't come to the archipelago to perpetrate atrocities. He becomes this thing under the weight of these events and in this kind of leadership situation. And that's a little bit of a microcosm, because by now, many of the Japanese had come to really hate the Filipinos. That's partially where this is coming from. When the war broke out, many Japanese soldiers believed very strongly they were fighting a war of liberation against white colonialism in Asia and the Pacific. You can kind of understand why. Well, what they come to terms with over time, their country was another colonial occupier and much more harsh than many of the white colonialists. And that was what the situation was in the Philippines. So many had come idealistically thinking, we're going to liberate the Filipinos from the Americans, and they found out the Filipinos were pro-American. And they're dealing with Filipino guerrillas that are sniping at them, killing them, booby-trapping, gathering intel for the Americans, so they grow into this hatred. And I think in a lot of sense, that explains something of these atrocities. Doesn't justify them, but that's partially where they're coming from. The fighting petered out in early March. U.S. troops counted 16,655 Japanese bodies. About 100,000 Manila residents lost their lives. I think the clear majority to Japanese atrocities. Over 1,000 American killed and 5,500 wounded. It took U.S. engineers months to recover you can see here the Americans trying to help civilians, including engineers trying to clean things up and medics trying to help folks. But it took engineers months to rebuild portions of the city. This is what it looked like. You know, it's just like, how do you even rebuild that? You know, to rebuild the harbor and whatnot. So the bad news, though, is yes, you've got Manila, but the campaign just continues to the rest of the war on Luzon. With 6th Army, just sort of fighting on, and then Eichelberger's 8th Army clears out the rest of the archipelago in this incredible series of amphibious operations that I mentioned moments ago. That it's just this incredible campaign of maneuver, aggressiveness, coordination that he oversees, but it's kind of strategically pointless because you're kind of going backwards. You're not going towards Japan here. So it isn't that well known. But he liberates something or about 7 million Filipinos with a major assist from Filipino guerrillas. It's really, if you're interested in the sort of operational art of modern military leadership, study that campaign because it's really one of the most remarkable in American military history, but it's not that well known. So in the meantime, this is the kind of fighting you're doing on Luzon in that kind of terrain. And notice the guy in the lead, that's a Filipino guerrilla, probably in a kind of recon kind of role. And leading you through the terrain. You're often ill-supplied, subsisting on a K ration or 2 per day. The violence of it all was just appalling. The firepower they're using is really extensive. The Americans are just kind of having to blast and burn the Japanese and fighting in this kind of terrain here. You know, imagine how hot and tired you would be. Just to give you a little sense of this, very, very quick fact. The 130th Infantry of the 33rd Infantry Division. Just one regiment fighting for a 4-month stretch. This was their expenditure of ordnance. 44,000 mortar shells, 6,400 105 millimeter self-propelled rounds, 30,000 grenades, 1.4 million machine gun bullets. You can even imagine that. And the regimental staff calculated the expenditure of, on average, 300 pounds of ordnance for every casualty inflicted on the Japanese. You know, think all the shipping that took and all the violence of that. And one Japanese soldier plaintively said in his diary, "We have underestimated the importance of material power and are suffering the consequences." Boy, that's for sure, right? So it's an infantryman's fight. They suffered about 90% of the casualties, and 6th Army suffers almost 38,000 battle casualties, but there's 93,400, quote, non-battle casualties, combat fatigue, disease, immersion foot, you know, all of that kind of stuff. People are going down with combat-related maladies that aren't called that in the 6th Army ledgers, but they really are. So it gives you a sense of how costly this was. It's really on par with Eisenhower's very bloody fall 1944 campaigns, the Argonne Forest in World War I, and, you know, a lot of different, Civil War battles. Just wanted to mention to you. So Japan, of course, doesn't surrender until August. And, by that time, the fighting is still going on here when the war ended. Yamashita himself does not surrender until after the famous surrender aboard the USS Missouri on September 2nd, 1945, when he finally comes out of the hills and surrenders. So in the wake of this, I just wanted to mention, there's this enormous sort of repatriation project, and it's primarily the Army taking the lead. 3.2 million Japanese military personnel and 2.8 million civilians will surrender and in most cases be repatriated back to Japan by 1946. So it's a monumental war that creates, of course, enormous numbers of legacies. Just to list a very few very quickly. The Army has grown into this kind of regional force, into arguably really the leading ground and most powerful ground arm on the planet by 1945. Second, from an Asian perspective, the war is just beginning. Post-colonial wars are now in the offing. And in the years to come, about 10 million people in Asia are going to lose their lives in post-colonial fighting. So for us as Americans, yes, the fighting is sort of ending. For other people in Asia, not so much. The Chinese Civil War, of course, is the great legacy, and the communists win it by 1949, and I would dare say that's the most important event in the whole history of the Cold War, arguably in modern history, and we're still paying the price for that now on some level. So you see another legacy of the alliances with Australia and New Zealand, which exists to this day. And of course, the savagery of the combat, as I mentioned, is very much a harbinger. So the American victory comes at a fearful cost. 111,606 Americans were killed or went missing in the war against Japan. And as I mentioned, the plurality of those deaths were among Army soldiers. If you were an Army soldier, ground soldier, you had a 2.3% death rate in the war against Japan. So those whose remains had been recovered were scattered among 133 cemeteries all over the Pacific and Asia. There were 9 in China, there were 55 in Burma and India. Overworked graves registration teams had buried them as carefully and respectfully as they possibly could. It was a horrible, thankless job, as you imagine. Some stared wide-eyed, a graves registration soldier recalled. Others had died in the middle of a scream and their mouths hung open. Others had no face at all. The work was nightmarish and it ate at our hearts. On May 16, 1946, Congress passed a law creating what was called the Return of the World War II Dead Program. And it was an attempt to recover and repatriate as many of the dead as they possibly could. And the very existence of this program, I would argue, kind of epitomized the country's wealth of being in a position to actually carry out such a program and having the priority to do it. A kind of a Republican, small r, commitment to the importance and dignity of the citizen and the individual, and that the government owed its citizens this in return for their service, and it owed families this kind of closure, and that it was then in a position to do it. And it also shows a common American value of the importance of recovering corporeal remains as a kind of tangible commemorative symbol of the mourn. It's very, very important to most families, and it had been for a long time. So next of kin made the decision whether to return the remains of their loved one or leave them in place overseas at an American Battle Monuments Commission cemetery, wherever they had fought and died. And that had been in place since World War I, the aftermath of World War I, where you had soldiers buried in France and so on and so forth. So same thing after World War II. Imagine the difficulty of those conversations. Who's the decision maker? Who has the input? Should you bring your loved one home or not? What do you think? Imagine that. It's very stressful and very difficult. If you were one of those families, you would have filled out Army Quartermaster Form 345 to send to the government to tell them what you wanted. 61% decided to bring them home. And of course, then that leads to a massive effort to find, recover, repatriate, and transport them home. And just as the Army had done so much of the fighting all over the globe, it now takes the lead in carrying out this program. Guys like this. There were 13,000 of them all over the earth. 13,000 soldiers working on recovery teams spread far and wide, literally to the ends of the earth, sometimes in really dangerous places, to recover the dead from small graves, like you see here, or temporary cemeteries that, of course, graves registration teams had built during the war. The job was exacting, it was almost ghoulish, similar to the way the Americans had fought the war, expending huge amounts of equipment and material. They'll do the same here. Crews sprayed a powdery hardening compound into body cavities to minimize stench and fluid leakage, an average of 2 to 5 pounds of compound per body. 1 gallon of deodorant spray per 20 bodies. 1 pair of gloves for every 3 to 5 bodies. By late summer 1947, they had recovered and processed 72,252 remains. So there were like over 30,000 in Manila, collected from all over the Philippines and from many other islands of the Pacific. There were 2,000 in Yokohama in Japan, mainly POWs who had died in Japan or airmen who had gone down on missions. 23,000 plus on Saipan, of course, the fighting in the Pacific Islands and whatnot. At last, on September 30th, 1947, the first set of 3,027 remains were ready for return aboard this ship, U.S. Army Transport Honda Knot. It was a 4,000-ton Liberty ship, which I mentioned the Army had its own ships during the war. This is an example of one of the ships that moved supplies and stuff overseas. Now, it's bringing the dead home. 10 other Army funeral ships would follow. The crew of the Honda Knot had meticulously cleaned the ship and lathered it with a fresh coat of paint for these descending aboard. The remains were now ensconced in steel caskets. The journey home took 10 days. So on October 10th, 1947, as you see here, Honda Knot majestically glided under the Golden Gate Bridge into San Francisco Bay. A cannon boomed in the distance. The ship dropped anchor opposite Marina Green, where hundreds gathered for a memorial service. It was quite somber, as you might imagine. The group included the mayor, Secretary of the Navy, and General Mark Clark. Port crews unloaded the now flag-draped caskets and loaded them into specially fitted rail cars for transportation to their various destinations. Telegrams were then sent to the next of kin, informing them of the imminent arrival of their loved one. Each casket was escorted by a specially trained serviceman of equal or higher rank than the deceased. The Army had established 15 major distribution centers around the country that I think read like a travelogue of America. San Francisco, Mira Loma, California, San Antonio, Fort Worth, Kansas City, Columbus, Ohio, Philadelphia, New York City, and Charlotte, just to name a few. Before groups large and small, in major cities and small towns, remote outposts alike, caskets were ceremoniously buried with full military honors wherever the next of kin chose, at a price of $564.50 per funeral. 78% of the returning dead were buried in a private cemetery or family plot, the rest in a national military cemetery like Arlington or any others around the country. In tear-soaked ceremonies, they were buried before groups large and small, some of them even anonymously almost. And among those now interred in their home soil were thousands of Army soldiers from every corner of the Pacific-Asia War. Private James Henson of the 192nd Tank Battalion, who died of beriberi as a POW after being captured in the Philippines. Sergeant Frank Simmons, who died in the South Pacific of pneumonia. PFC Norman Petschauer, killed in action with the 27th Infantry Division fighting the Battle of Saipan in the summer 1944. PFC Louis Profeta, once captain of his high school football team, killed in action at Buna in 1942. Sergeant John Zangerly, 37th Infantry Division, killed in action in the ferocious fighting at Manila of the kind we discussed tonight. Lieutenant Buford Cooper, killed in a vehicle accident in Burma on the Stillwell Road that connected India to China. So just like that, overseas, killed in a vehicle accident. And PFC Monroe Hicks of Sikeston, Missouri, whose hometown paper referred to him as both a returning hero and, quote, a colored soldier. In 1951, after 4 years and the shipment home of 171,000 Americans from Europe and the Pacific, and the expenditure of nearly $164 million, the Return of the World War II Dead program officially ended. But I would suggest that the mourning never really did. Thank you.